At this moment, the TV is broadcasting the latest information about a comet named Clark. It will pass closely by Earth, and experts in astronomy assure people there is no need to worry. Even if some small fragments enter the atmosphere, there is no cause for concern. However, John and his wife Allison are not concerned with this news. Their relationship is in a severe trust crisis, and John has moved into the guest room. For the sake of their son Nathan, the two are trying hard to repair the rift between them. The next day, John took Nathan to the supermarket, and as they arrived, they noticed everyone around them was looking up at the sky. A large number of military planes simultaneously took off, which was clearly unusual, and Clark was now visible to the naked eye. While they were picking up items for a party, John's phone rang. He thought it was an Amber Alert, a child abduction warning system used mainly in the US and Canada. When a child is abducted, law enforcement sends out alerts through various media to involve the public in a wide-scale search. But to John's surprise, the phone showed a presidential alert, which is typically sent to all citizens at once. At the same time, the TV in John's house was broadcasting the same content. However, Allison missed this crucial information. At this moment, both the ground and the sky were filled with military personnel evacuating, and coupled with the earlier phone call, John immediately felt a bad premonition. When he returned home, the neighbors had already arrived. A fragment was about to crash into the Atlantic, and countless onlookers gathered at the scene. Eager to witness this historic moment, John found his wife and shared the information he had received. But she didn't believe him. Only after John described what he had seen did Allison realize the severity of the situation. Clark was now visible on the TV screen, and the long-awaited moment had arrived. But John and his wife were extremely nervous. When the comet's fragment entered the sea, there was no massive explosion as they had imagined. Just as people began to wonder what was happening, John stepped outside, and countless birds started fleeing. The next moment, a powerful shockwave sent John flying. Before anyone could understand what had happened, the news reported the latest update. A meteor the size of a football field had deviated from its expected trajectory and landed in central Florida, with its shockwave clearly felt 2,400 kilometers away. When the images of the meteor instantly destroying a city appeared on screen, people finally understood the severity of the situation, and more meteors, large and small, would fall. At that moment, John's phone rang again. When he answered, the screen exploded with the contents of the call. Their family of 3 had been selected. At the same time, everyone else was warned not to accompany them. With no exceptions, everyone checked their phones, hoping to receive similar notifications, but nothing came. They rushed toward their house, perhaps hoping to see the same message on TV. John and Allison quickly packed their things and headed to the designated location, but the next moment, a neighbor stopped them. The neighbor said that things were not as simple as they first thought. What should they do now? John said he didn't know, but the neighbor didn't believe him. In that moment, the neighbor realized he had lost composure. After all, this was not John's fault. The neighbor only hoped that if John received any further information, he would let them know. For example, telling them where they could be safer. Of course, everyone knew this was just a form of self-comfort. When disaster strikes, don't expect others to save you. Only you can save yourself. The car hadn't gone far when it was stopped again. The woman had no other requests but asked if John could take her daughter along. The message had clearly stated no one else could be brought along. But at that moment, John dared not and would not take the risk. Reality was harsh. As the neighbors looked on, they felt even more hopeless. Inside the car, Allison could only repeatedly apologize to her friend, as she too was powerless to address the crisis. Nathan, sitting in the back, was very sad the girl was his good friend. At that moment, he took out a blanket, trying to find some warmth, but he didn't notice his insulin had fallen out. Outside the airport, long lines formed as countless people who received the news tried to enter the Ark of Noah, but they had no qualifications. When the world resets, all kinds of supplies will become incredibly precious, and they could not afford to waste them on unnecessary things. The fortunate ones entered one by one, while the abandoned people could only let out helpless screams, but to no avail. Inside the airport, the evacuation process was proceeding in an orderly manner. John's family entered smoothly and received wristbands as their only form of identification. Before boarding, everyone was required to throw away unnecessary luggage. At that moment, Allison noticed her son's insulin was missing. After inquiring, she learned that Nathan had opened the bag earlier. At such a crucial moment, This situation left Allison at a loss, but her son couldn't do without his medication, so Nathan reluctantly decided to go back and look for it. John quickly reached the entrance and learned that he could re-enter as long as he had his wristband. Meanwhile, Allison found a personnel officer and informed him that her husband had gone back to get insulin for their son, but now they wanted to board the plane and hoped the officer could arrange for John to join their flight later. The officer immediately called over a nearby soldier. Allison wanted to explain but saw his expression and decided to leave. Unfortunately, they had no more opportunities. All selected individuals could not have any diseases. Mother and son were quickly escorted to the airport control room. If they hadn't brought it up themselves, no one would have had the time to check. But now that it had been discovered, they were absolutely not allowed to board, which Allison couldn't accept. She hoped they could turn a blind eye, but the response was simply one of helplessness. Faced with Allison's aggressive questioning, the commander, who initially did not want to explain, now had to state the facts. None of these armed personnel were selected, and the only reason they were standing here was out of their own volition. They knew more than ordinary people, and these evacuees were the hope for the continuation of humanity, but they were not among them. What they were doing now was solely to ensure that the spark of hope could leave here safely. The only way she could help Allison was by contacting other departments to find John and stop him. At that moment, John was about to board the plane, but he had no idea which flight his wife and son were on. So, he found a soldier and described Allison and Nathan's features, but with such a large-scale migration, who could remember a stranger they passed by? As long as you had a wristband, you'd get on a plane, and they'd all head to the same destination. John reluctantly accepted this information. On the other side, the commander received a call everyone was boarding the plane, and there was nothing more he could do now. Besides, there were many other issues waiting for him to handle outside. But Allison could not accept this explanation. If her husband left, what would she and the child do? But the reality was that inside the temporary tents at the airport, there were countless others in even worse situations. Of course, the people involved always feel like they're the worst off. At this moment, John had already boarded the plane, hoping his luck was good enough to find his wife and son here. He called out their names over and over, but received no response. Then the pilot requested everyone sit down as the plane was about to take off. John explained his situation, but the pilot had no time to worry about personal issues. Though John was desperate and dissatisfied with the pilot's attitude, he had no choice but to comply. As John pulled out his phone to contact his wife, he found that his messages couldn't go through. At that moment, a man nearby saw the medication in John's hand and immediately reminded him that his nephew also had diabetes, which is why he couldn't board the plane. Just as the cabin door was about to close, John rushed out. He wanted to get off, but the pilot told him the plane wouldn't wait for one person. After receiving John's response, the cabin door slowly reopened. At that moment, a large group of people rushed out from the distance. They didn't have wristbands and had to rely on their own means to find a chance to survive. The sudden scene left everyone stunned, and John didn't leave the plane quickly enough, causing the door to remain open. The next moment, intense gunfire broke out. A soldier holding a fuel pipe was shot, and John stood there for a full 10 minutes before turning to tell everyone that the plane was going to explode. Run quickly. The scene instantly descended into chaos, and John finally ran toward the exit, feeling satisfied. The next moment, the plane exploded, setting off a chain reaction and blowing up the surrounding planes. Soon after, a powerful shockwave sent countless people flying. When John returned to the car, he couldn't find his wife, but he found a note she had left behind. It said, "We've gone to my dad's house, and we'll meet you there." At that moment, John finally felt relieved. Meanwhile, Allison and Nathan had arrived at a pharmacy. They found the much-needed insulin in a refrigerated cabinet. Just as they were about to leave, gunshots rang out from outside. At that moment, order had completely collapsed, and Allison and her son crawled slowly on the ground. Suddenly, a young boy appeared in front of them. Allison begged him to look at young Nathan, and the older boy extended his left hand, pulling Allison up while telling her to hurry and leave. The mother and son, having narrowly escaped death, ran down the street without looking back. Just then, her gaze locked onto a woman in the distance, who was shouting, "Please, give us a ride, we beg you." When she saw it was a mother and child, the woman relaxed and agreed to take them along. The couple's destination was the airport, but they didn't have wristbands. They were just hoping their luck would be good enough to get in. During the conversation, they mentioned the missing John, and Nathan directly told them that his father was already on a plane. It was an offhand remark, but in this hopeless moment, It caught the woman's attention, as more and more meteor fragments approached the atmosphere. While everyone was busy fleeing, a group of young people stood on the top floor throwing an end-of-the-world party, enjoying their final moments. On the other side, John found a car heading to Canada and sat silently in it. At that moment, Colin, sitting beside him, noticed John's wristband and asked about his job. When he learned that John was a construction engineer, he was relieved. Colin's mother had also been selected because she was a doctor. The two quickly found common ground and began to chat. John was curious as to why Colin hadn't left with his mother. Colin revealed that he hadn't been in touch with his family for 7 years, and it was only before he left that his sister had told him about everything. John shared his own experience, and when Colin heard that John was looking for his wife and son, he hesitated for a moment before telling John something. The plane would land at a shelter in Canada, and Colin hoped John would come with him, but John declined. He was going to his father-in-law's house to search for his family. Colin didn't stop him. Colin told John the location of the plane, hoping they could leave together later. In such a situation, Colin shared such precious information with a stranger, showing that he was more selfless than many people. At least John couldn't compare to him. Meanwhile, on the other side, Allison was forcibly thrown out of the car by the driver. After learning that they had been kicked off the plane, the driver decided to take Nathan for himself. Allison's resistance was in vain. Her wristband was gone, her son was gone, her husband was missing, and at that moment, it felt like life no longer mattered. She only hoped there would be a car that could save her son if she could catch up with it. But the reality was harsh. Just like how they had treated their neighbors at first, all she received was indifference. At this moment, John was facing the same crisis as his wife. Several strangers wanted his wristband, but John wasn't about to hand it over willingly. Seeing their aggressive attitude, Colin intervened to stop them, but before he could finish his sentence, the strangers had already started attacking. Seeing this, John fought back with the man holding a hammer. After the tarpaulin was blown away, the driver could clearly see what was happening behind him. He decided to pull over to the side of the road but crashed into a nearby pickup truck. The next moment, the entire vehicle swerved, and John and the others were thrown out by the inertia. John grabbed the hammer from the ground, but even so, the other two weren't willing to give up. As long as they could get one wristband, they'd find a way to get the second. John kept swinging the hammer to stop them from attacking him. In his overexcitement, he accidentally drove the hammer through one of their skulls. At that moment, he no longer needed the wristband. Colin, thrown out of the car, had already lost his life. Meanwhile, Allison, in despair, was still walking towards the airport. She didn't know if her husband had already boarded the plane or if she would ever see her son again. At that moment, a car slowly pulled over, heading to the airport, and there was just enough space for her. In that instant, Allison finally experienced the joy of being helped by someone else. Meanwhile, the couple had arrived at the ticketing gate with Nathan. They lied, claiming to be Allison and John, but the man didn't have John's wristband, only claiming his wristband had been stolen. After much pleading, the soldier agreed to let them in. Just then, Nathan, who had been silent all along, finally spoke up, saying, "They're not my parents." Soon after, Allison arrived at the airport and immediately found the soldier in charge of inspections, telling him about her situation. But hundreds of children had already passed through, and who could remember who was who? The soldier suggested she visit the emergency management camp. Maybe they had some information. Allison then began searching through the open tents for Nathan, but with time passing, her heart grew heavier. Finally, when she reached the last tent, she found her son. In that moment, her worries completely disappeared. John, on the other hand, had broken into a private house. After finding the owner was absent, he turned on the TV and watched news about the worldwide disaster. The world had already descended into a sea of flames. After a quick check, he left a note for the homeowner. "I'm John. I took your car. If I survive, I promise to return it." John soon arrived at his father-in-law's house. However, when the others saw him, there was no joy, only disdain. At that point, John explained how he had lost his wife and son, and Dale finally left the poker table. Allison had already told her father everything, but John didn't want to discuss it. After all, it wasn't something he was proud of, and Dale didn't force him to talk. Soon after, they received a call from Allison. She and Nathan had arrived at the local station, and the two quickly headed there. The brief separation had made them realize how important they were to each other. When Allison saw her father, she cried like a little girl, hugging him tightly. For the family to reunite was already an incredibly difficult thing, but just then, the latest news came through: the disaster might lead to the extinction of all humankind. Whether it was the oceans, the land, or the sky, the true location of the shelters had also been revealed. On Greenland, there were 5 air raid shelters from World War II. After hearing this, John was sure that Colin's words were true, that plane really did exist. He decided to take his wife and son there. Dale, watching quietly, didn't comment on the decision. After packing up, John found Dale and asked if he would go with them. This wasn't a disaster that humans could resist, but Dale didn't care about that. Dale asked John how he viewed their marriage and why he had cheated on Allison. John readily admitted it and said he would carry the burden of that mistake for the rest of his life. He didn't expect Dale to forgive him, and all he wanted now was to get his wife and son into the bunker. When Allison heard John's words, her heart was once again conquered by him. Everyone had their own choices. While he was her father, he had no right to interfere with his daughter's decisions. Allison wanted her father to go with them, but he decisively refused. He and his wife had married and had children here. This was their home, full of happy memories. Allison's mother had died here, and he wanted to stay here, waiting for his own end. That way, they would reunite in another world, continuing their unfinished love. Just then, a meteorite fell not far away. They didn't have much time left. Dale gave John his beloved car and weapons, with only one request: protect his daughter and grandson. That night, the family of 3 arrived at the small airport Colin had mentioned. By now, the plane had already reached the runway, and seeing this, John accelerated, chasing after it. At that moment, the plane was turning around, and John's goal was to force it to stop. If it didn't stop, he would crash right into it, since the result would be death anyway. None of these people were getting away. Eventually, under John's threat, the family successfully boarded the plane. Just as they entered Greenland, a huge meteorite fell to the ground. The dust flew thousands of meters up, and the shockwave quickly spread out. The next moment, the entire plane was struck as if by a giant slap. The pilots struggled to control the plane, but the earlier shock had already left the plane powerless. They had no choice but to make an emergency landing. Fortunately, the 2 pilots were highly skilled. Through quick maneuvers, they crashed into an iceberg. Thanks to their efforts, everyone in the cabin was unharmed, but the 2 pilots would remain there forever. When the survivors saw the base, everyone was filled with indescribable excitement. They were finally going to survive. Soon, the authorities discovered this group of survivors and sent vehicles to take them back to the base. Meanwhile, the largest piece of meteorite debris struck Greenland. The damage it caused would be catastrophic, and in that instant, everyone rushed toward the depths below. In the control room, calculations were being made to assess the scale of the destruction. At that moment, everyone was praying, hoping they could survive this crisis. 9 months later, the world had fallen into silence. The once glorious metropolises, along with those who couldn't leave, were now buried beneath the rubble. Finally, the protective door of Greenland was opened. At the same time, shelters around the world began to restore communication. After this disaster, the world no longer worried about overpopulation or resource depletion. The Earth's surface had become riddled with scars, and a new era of apocalypse had arrived.